In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Hello, Sublation magazine readers, Sublation media viewers, Sublaters. It is I, Douglas Lain, returning from the fray, from the Twitter battles that I've been engaging in over the last week. So if I look tired and disheveled today, which I think I do a little bit, that's why. They've gotten to me again. And this is
Ashley Frawley. Also, I have dealt with the spillover of Doug's Twitter battles because we all know, I'm so sorry to say this, but we all know that when there's a pile-on, if there's a woman available, we're going to pile on her. So Doug was getting a bunch of crap for something. I don't know. He texted me and he said, oh God, my followers, blah, blah, blah. And I thought it was the same kind of, you've been doing the disinformation thing for like 2 months. I was like, oh, it's so annoying. So I went on Twitter and I was like, Doug's followers are mad at him for thinking that perhaps government control of information might be a problem. Give him a follow. Oh boy. All of these vultures turn and they're like, fresh meat. And they came for me. And I didn't, and they're like, you liar. Why are you a liar? And I was like, what?
Yeah, I mean, we're only really talking about a couple of people, really. And the truth is that, I stayed out. I had too many drinks last night. That's why I looked disheveled. But what brought on the onslaught from a few people, and maybe they had, I guess somebody had a lot of followers that came after you. Is that right?
Yeah.
So, but it was, I had texted or tweeted. I got to separate texting and tweeting. That the suppression of Matt Walsh's "What is a Woman" on Twitter demonstrated how Twitter was not going to be able to resist the pressure from governments around the world, including the United States government, most likely, but certainly in this present moment from the EU, to rejoin the battle against disinformation. The EU had given Twitter an ultimatum, which was that if they didn't rejoin their disinformation guidance board, they would be blocked from all of Europe. Twitter would be blocked. And I saw the change in leadership at Twitter, the new CEO, and the reversal of a decision to premiere Matt Walsh's "What is a Woman" movie as coinciding with this additional pressure from Europe. Not that it was, not that the EU said don't show Matt Walsh's "What is a Woman," but rather that the old policies of Twitter were kind of slowly being reinstated in an effort to bring back advertisers and to get in line with what the EU was demanding and what, who knows, might be being demanded of Twitter from within the US government. So that was my tweet. I said something along the lines of, this shows that the disinformation war will eventually beat Twitter. And that made a lot of people angry. One, because I think they thought I was saying it was a great movie or something, or I was supporting Matt Walsh in his political project.
Because everyone didn't go to high school apparently and never learned the one debate line every 16-year-old learns, which is, I condemn what you say, but I will fight to the death for your right to say. Apparently everyone's forgotten that. But I think also they were mad about that. I didn't even see it. I know I missed that because I was with my family. It's a weekend. So I missed this whole thing. But I think they were mad and just were looking for somebody. They were mad about this documentary and they were kind of looking. It was the sort of wrong example to use because they were out looking for blood.
Yeah, in the United States, I don't know where Dusty 48 is from, but I want to point out that since transphobia is not disinfo, it's bigotry. That's not the same thing. And that's true. There in the United States, hate speech is not illegal. It is legally protected speech. To rise to the level of a threat and something that really is illegal, it has to be proximate in time and directed towards a group, a real group, not an abstract group, and immediate. So like if you say, let's burn down all the houses of the billionaires, that is legally protected speech. If you say to a mob of people carrying torches, let's burn down Elon Musk's house, and they go immediately and burn down his house, that is illegal speech. And so in the EU, the Disinformation Guidance Board and the overall control of information, including with hate speech, are kind of combined. And the laws within the EU are different. So like for instance, Ireland has much harsher laws around hate speech than even the UK does, I believe. And what that means is that the most draconian or the most far-reaching hate speech laws in the EU probably defines the EU standards. So, so that's if you see right here, let's burn down Elon Musk's house. That's legal
Why?
speech. No, but that would be legally protected speech because we're not proximate to his house being burned down in time. There's not a group of people carrying torches, so you're safe, Dr. Forbin, from legal penalty. All right.
Anyway, so to be clear, we're not talking about us being canceled. Obviously not. We haven't been canceled. No, the point that's got us kind of thinking about this desire to suppress something, and generally the desire to kind of use policy to suppress positions that may be really bad, actually, and that we don't want. So I actually so after I was getting a bunch of shit for a documentary I hadn't seen and didn't know anything about, I watched it. And here's the thing, like, why do we need to go back to gender essentialism? Like, it's not like hateful to put forward that argument, but it is kind of stupid. And we don't need to do that. We don't need to say like, okay, like sex is, biological, and it may or may not be immutable depending on the state of our science as we move forward. At the moment, it appears to be, more or less immutable. But gender is how we decide to live with each other, right? It's every culture has all sorts of gender roles. And in particular, in our culture, our gender roles are loosening up, and it becomes less clear what it means. So what? You have certain genitalia, but what does that mean? It doesn't determine who you're going to be and how you're going to live your life. And we need to have an open conversation about that, because we live in a pluralistic society. We have lots and lots of different groups that are going to disagree about things. And if you think about, for example, the situation with abortion in the UK. So abortion is famously a position issue. That is, all sides cannot agree on whether it even is a problem and what to do about it. And you have a kind of tacit agreement in current abortion law where nobody really gets exactly what they want, but they're more or less, there's this kind of tenuous kind of consensus, or some bargaining happened, where the people who disagree with abortion are kind of satisfied that it is not really affirmed as a value, like no questions asked, whatever, it's just on demand, that there are limitations and that it is controlled. So they're kind of satisfied with that. And the people who are, think that abortion should be on demand and there shouldn't be any limitations, and, there's just, trust women, all these sorts of things, they're kind of satisfied that you effectively can get abortion on demand, effectively. It's not exactly what the law says, though. So we have this kind of agreement that came about through bargaining. And what's happened toward the present is that on an increasing number of issues, we have decided that no bargaining is possible, and we can never reach a consensus. And those who disagree are, and I'm talking about across the political spectrum here, those who disagree are groomers, or they're pedophiles, or they're whatever. And then on the other side, racists, bigots, whatever. And so there can be no consensus. It's all or nothing. And so this leads to, and this is what I wanted to talk about, what Joseph Gusfield calls coercive policymaking. So this is just basic kind of value conflict theory. If you go on Sublation Media on our Patreon, I've got a lecture on value conflict theory. But there are three outcomes of debate in our contemporary democratic societies. As I've said, bargaining, consensus, or naked power. And if you've basically said you can have no bargaining and there can be no consensus, then the only other option is naked power. You just crush the opposition. You do everything that you can to crush the opposition, any kind of dissent. But the problem is, as Weber says, our societies and our pluralistic societies and so on, our policies have to have consensus around them. Legitimacy. They have to have some kind of legitimacy. And policies that are made through naked power tend to lack legitimacy. But if we've already agreed there can be no consensus, what happens is when the other side takes power, they just crush the other side. And so what you get is either the worst of all possible worlds. You get the extreme of the right wing, or you get the extreme of the left wing. There can be no middle ground. And what I think we need to do is calm the fuck down and start talking to each other. Because one thing that I have noticed that is really bad is we're starting to move backwards on a lot of issues. Obviously, we know this has happened with abortion. But on the trans issue, we have moved backwards. Like, do we really need to go back to biological essentialism? Right? It's either gender is a social construct, and so is sex, apparently. I don't know. This is what happened in that documentary, that they weren't able to just kind of make that distinction. They were all dancing around it. Or like it is determined from birth, and who you're going to be is just determined, and you're locked in that box, which nobody wants either. And also doesn't make any sense because that's not how we're living now. It's not, our gender roles have loosened up, as I said. Mm-hmm. So this is the situation in which we find ourselves at the moment, where one side takes power, and they're doing things like, oh, we're going to take the kids away of people who want to have gender affirming care. And then it's like, we're going to take the kids away of the people who don't want it. You know what I mean? They're just like, we got to go in there and do the most extreme things. This is bad for everybody. Like I saw, who is it? Is it Debbie Haywood? Oh God, I keep forgetting her darn name. But anyways, quite a level-headed person who's willing to wade into these debates at great personal risk. And I was watching a public debate, and people were calling her a he. And they were like, and someone said, well, why do that? And they're like, well, we have an obligation to tell the truth. Like, what are you talking about? When it comes to society, truth is, I'm sorry to say, truth is a moving goalpost. Like the truth of something, we have to work out, right? Like gender roles have to be worked out as a society. We have to decide how we're going to live out these roles and what positions we're going to play in this whole game, right? It's not like, oh, I need to tell the truth about what someone's genitalia are. And that's going backwards even to what the tacit consensus was in the past, 20, 30 years ago. Which was if you kind of passed, then you were treated as the opposite sex. And now it's like, no, we have to have this essentialist kind of outlook. And I think we've got to be able to talk to each other because things like this are happening. There has to be some sane middle ground. Otherwise, we're just crushing each other. And this is not good.
I mean, the whole topic is one where to wade into it risks making people who have very strong opinions about it very, very angry at you.
Yeah.
So, for instance, you just said, well, if you passed, then you should be treated like a woman. And I
didn't say that was the tacit agreement in society. The other side of that is that it's not good to force somebody to have to go through medical transitions and stuff.
Right, that's not good. I know. I'm just saying. I happen to know that is a very hot button topic within the trans community. I know enough to know that, and whether or not you should aim at passing or not, or within the trans community, my understanding is there's divisions and around those kinds of topics. But the major point is that we need to be in a politics and negotiation. I mean, we, as people on the left, we have to be. We do not have the power to crush the capitalist class at the moment, right? We
Yeah.
do not have the power, to even crush opposition to, for instance, free speech. I can't just, cancel the Department of Homeland Security. I'd like to, but I can't. So I have to be able to negotiate. I have to be able to listen and try to convince a lot of people about the dangers that I see if I'm going to change the society that I'm in. I know that.
Yeah, and the thing is, when people will say like, "My identity should not be up for debate," yeah, it sucks. It definitely sucks. It sucks that like you had to fight a war to end slavery, and it sucks that the most downtrodden in society had to be enlisted to fight in that war. That's shit, man. But that's kind of how we are progressing in our shitty society. Like, that's what we all have to do. I remember I was on like BBC Big Questions once, and there was like this priest sitting in the front row, and he was like, "How dare you, Ashley? How dare you outsource, the fight for a better world to the working class?" And I was like, "I'm sorry, what?" Like that. How is that outsourcing? You're so used to it being outsourced to NGOs and stuff that you have completely lost the idea. Well, he probably never had it to begin with, but of this idea of revolution as the self-emancipation of the working class, right? The self-emancipation of the working class. I don't want to have to do that. It's a shame, a horrible shame, that probably these sorts of things will involve a lot of fighting and so on. But that's what we have to do. That's the task. That Lenin wrote in his wonderful obituary of Engels, they talking about socialists of his day, or Marx and Engels' time. And he says they dreamt of a socialism without struggle. This is kind of where we are now. We think that if we just kind of, maneuver correctly, we can have a socialism without struggle. But that's not how it works. And even, you might say revolution is naked power. Yes, it's probably the best example of naked power. But even revolution isn't just crushing the other side. It certainly is. Well, that's a large part of it. But, Marx writes, even in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels write that a portion of the capitalist class will see which way the wind is blowing, sort of peel off and join what is the progressive step for wealth production and the future of humanity. Even when we moved from feudalism to capitalism, capitalists had to settle accounts with the old feudal order. Yes, of course, there was the French Revolution and the Terror and all that sort of thing. But there was also a lot of negotiation and a lot of, buying off the old ruling class to allow things to continue. That's how any kind of mature politics has to carry forward. Because what's happening now is, yes, you might win a victory for a short period of time, but the policies, if you have not convinced people, if they're not the result of any kind of struggle on the part of society, they will lack legitimacy. And when people encounter them for the first time, they're going to be shocked. And there may be pushback. And so we have to have a struggle in society for that legitimacy that will underpin these policies as we move forward.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think that it's important to remind ourselves how society actually functions and how change happens, rather than commit ourselves to positions, in an all or nothing manner. Just because when you do that second thing, what you're really aiming at doing is making yourself feel good, maybe, or make yourself look good. Also, it gives you an ability to justify targeting individuals for insults or attempted cancellations or things along those lines, but it does not actually move the majority of people forward into a collective project of politics, which is what we're hoping to accomplish. I think that the one big difficulty today is that you mentioned that priest who said, how dare you outsource, I'm sorry, this onto the working class, the responsibility to change society onto the working class. And the assumption was the people who are responsible, I guess, would be MPs or professionals, or maybe academics, and the which is essentially saying we expect change to come from the powerful. That's who has the responsibility and the obligation to run society for us in our interest. And Gene pointed out that the idea that most of the left has is that their task is to make complaints to the state and basically ask to see the manager over and over and over again, so that they can change the policies of the establishment enough that they can tolerate it, I guess. And the actual goal is to create a political life in a society where the everyday people, where the working class and the masses run society cooperatively with each other.
Well, here's the thing. They do it because it works, right? They appeal to corporations and appeal to the managers and so on because it works, or it has worked at least up until now. But as I said, and like I just finished a report on this, man, I got railed just for like being adjacent to someone who mentioned a documentary. I am about to get fucking eviscerated. Because I just finished a report for the evil MCC about precisely this, and where I go through this process of how policymaking has transpired via covert means. And what happened was that once people, they specifically like sought to change policy. So people who were activists for a much expanded idea of gender, because gender had been a shorthand for women for a very long time, and then gradually began to expand to mean all sorts of other things. But the fact that gender was already institutionalized became a way for people with much more expanded views to make headway in policy. And there were explicit statements from these sort of lobby groups that the more you keep it away from the public, the more success you're going to have. And that the public was kind of ignorant. But the thing is that if you think of like the ideal of democracy in sort of a cliched sense, it's that you change people's minds in order to change policy. What was going on was that they wanted to change policy to change people's minds. And again, it was very effective. So they managed to institutionalize a much expanded understanding of gender in this way. But again, it lacks legitimacy. So when people experience it on the ground, people who might have been quite open to it, like if you look at surveys, people are open to the idea of people just live your life as you wish. But then there are certain little areas of tension where there's less certainty. Right? These are the things that kind of need to be discussed and debated. I mean, to find some kind of middle ground. People saw this and they perceived it as being kind of forced on them. And there was a lot of pushback there. So you had groups organizing in opposition. And that's normal. In society, you have groups that will, you want the smoothest path to policymaking is if you can construct your issue as a valence issue, as positively balanced. There's just no negative here. It's just a no-brainer. And that's what activists did. They went straight to policymakers on the back of gay marriage and so on, the success of LGBT movements. And they were like, this is the same thing. And as you're passing this kind of policy, it's just a no-brainer. It's just an extension of this. So they packed it as kind of valence issue. And what you don't want is to attract any kind of opposition, but it happens. And groups will organize in opposition. But and through a kind of struggle and debate, we can sometimes, bargain or reach a consensus. But their decision was made early on that there could be no consensus, that nothing could be dropped. But that's not totally accurate. Like in some countries, like in Ireland, there was a little bit of give and take, but activists like expressly lamented this, like, okay, now it's going to take years to get what we want. But that's kind of how policymaking works. Like activists will often start with something that's a lot more extreme than people are ready for, and then they get the first thing and then they use that as okay, let's push it a little bit further, It's not necessarily anything wrong with that, but they kind of saw that as a bad thing, as a kind of lamentable thing. It was all or nothing. And this led to a lot of negative kinds of situations. So they do it because it's successful. It works. It worked for them to get these policies in place. But the problem is that it's these, as I keep saying, these policies lack legitimacy. People were like shocked when, one of the tactics was to kind of use inroads into sex education, where teachers were kind of like, didn't really want to deliver it. And so NGOs and certain activist groups could go in and give this sex education, which was tailored in the ways that they wanted it. The thing is, it was a big mistake because sex education is famously a position issue. Long before any of this sort of expanded understandings of gender that are a little bit at variance, some of them are a little bit at variance with sort of norms that exist in certain societies, particularly in like Eastern Europe. This became like a huge problem because sex education is so controversial. And so now you've made it even more controversial. And so when people came across this for the first time, often when their children were talking about it, they became very mad. And like they would have been mad anyway, because sex education is already a hot topic, right? Mm-hmm. So this is kind of the issue that we have now. And now I think we're at a point now where a lot of this stuff is we're pushing to other extremes. So it was like, we can't have any consensus. So it's like, fine. I want this, no sex education, that's not good either. So we have the extremes and that's it. And everybody's just trying to crush each other and nobody wins in this game. People who just want to live their lives as they please are now finding it much more difficult, and it's just getting ratcheted up. And it's like all or nothing. This is really bad.
I had someone on Facebook ask me if I would prefer that rather than having this movie, What is a Woman, suppressed, if I would prefer to establish a trans Bill of Rights so that people like Matt Walsh would no longer be relevant, that just wouldn't be an issue because it would be established constitutionally, I guess, that certain rights simply were granted to all of society around issues of gender and transition. And I'm not sure what should be in the Trans Bill of Rights, but I do think that there are aspects within a Republican, Democratic, bourgeois society that have to be protected from the majority, even a Democratic majority. For instance, you wouldn't want to have a vote on whether or not everyone should receive due process, or whether or not certain crimes were so heinous that they didn't, that those who were accused of them no longer had the rights to due process. You wouldn't want to bring that to a vote, that this is a fundamental principle protecting all individuals in society, and or you wouldn't want to bring it to a vote about whether certain things should be censored that don't rise to the level of threats or fraud or obscenity and so forth, but just because they are the wrong thing. You wouldn't want to have that be brought to a democratic vote. That there are aspects of society which are kind of established through, I guess, governing bodies to protect minorities and all the way down to individuals in the society. That's so I can see why trans people would want to establish their civil rights on that basis, rather than in this long process of convincing a majority that they should have those rights.
Well, even that would require a Bill of Rights. Even that would require something so huge, would require some debate and consensus on the part of society. I actually don't think that's a bad idea, because we'd have to work out some of these issues that we're having. And people say, like, oh, there was a question here, like, why should sex education be an issue? I don't think it should be an issue, but it fucking is. Okay, like, because some groups in society think that it is, and they're
because people are religious. People have, actually, it makes sense. Sex is a very fraught subject. It has, even within the most progressive liberals, there are all sorts of concerns around sexual morality.
Like there's all sorts of and we're like, oh, it's no big deal. We just want blah, blah, blah. But there's so much that we have to talk about. Like, Okay, age of consent. That's really fucking tricky, because anytime that you put like an age down, then you create all sorts of arbitrary problems of arbitrariness, right? Like, oh, it's like the eve of my 18th birthday. All these kinds of things come into these are tricky issues. They're real difficult. They're hard. And just to like wave your hand and say, oh, well, we just want blah, blah, blah. I'm afraid, sorry, but once you get down to the nitty gritty of social policy and law and so on, it does get to be quite tricky. That there are all sorts of cases that will come up that challenge what we think is real. It's just a real simple thing. It's just a real simple thing. It's no big deal. Yeah, I understand why you want to frame it that way, because it allows you to get exactly what you want. But as time goes on, people are going to push around the edges, because society is messy. Life is messy. There are all sorts of things I wish were not a problem. I wish were not issues. I wish that we could just move forward with them, but they are. And people think that they are. And there are groups in society who feel threatened, for better or for worse, right or wrong. And we have to find a way through. Like, as I told you with abortion policy, if it was all or nothing, we'd be fucked. Every time a government changed, we'd be fucked, because they would just crush the other side. We have a kind of, and this is what's happening in the United States right now, right? The people just come into power and they just take the most extremes and start crushing each other. It's good for nobody. At least in the UK, we have a semblance of a functioning abortion policy. Now, people are still fighting about it, absolutely. And these things will go on. And we might end up with something worse as a result of that. I fully accept that. But that's what we have to do in a society where people hold lots of different values, come from lots of different backgrounds, and there are lots of different interests at play. I know that this is a very liberal thing that I am saying, but this is realistic, because this is the world that we live in.
Yeah. And that gives me a nice segue back into my pet topic, which is free speech and disinformation. One of the things that we have to accept in a society based on equality and cooperation and democracy and those kinds of
I hear people
values.
screaming, we don't really have equality. Sorry.
Yeah, but when you aim at equality, and you aim at democracy and self responsibility, individually and collectively, you have to create conditions where the truth can be debated. If you leave the truth to elites, whether the truth is determined by a priest or a king or an NGO, then what you're doing is you're handing over your responsibility to understand how the world works and what should happen to those bodies, whether that's again king or a priest or an NGO. And we what we presume on the left, I think, is if the progressives are in power, then because there's some sense of shared values between people who are consider themselves on the left and the Democratic Party, say people who run based on bringing these people, basically based on creating a coalition of different groups and promising them that they do, they'll represent those values. We presume that we no longer have the responsibility to work out with others what the consensus should be, and we presume that our values will always rule the day. That those things will be able to, always sway the progressive state eventually into our favor. Certain, especially if we crush the opposition, if we, kill off the Republican Party and only have the Democrats in power, then the progressives will always have the upper hand. The progressive people will always have the upper hand, and we'll have a much better society for everyone. That's the idea, I think. But the truth is, the capitalist state has its own logic. The capitalist state has its own agenda. The capitalist state is not there primarily to serve the public and to enact your values. It's there to manage the crisis, which is called capitalism. And because of that obligation by the capitalist state, it will change and move in multiple directions and reverse itself based on what's needed by the capitalist class and the overall, society. So you have, you're trusting this monstrous machine to serve you, and in reality, you're only serving it. So.
Yeah, so now people are in the chat are saying, what are you talking about? This is the tyranny of the majority. Just because something is a majority doesn't mean that it's necessarily true. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that the majority of people have to say something. What I'm saying is that I'm taking a very pragmatic approach. And I have in my mind Ken and Malik's Quest for a Moral Compass, where he goes through in like 1,000 pages, I think, seems like 1,000 pages, where he goes through like this fact that that humanity is searching for a moral compass that can just give us the truth, that can just tell us, light the way. And for most of human history, tradition did that, religion did that. It was like, well, why do this? Because that's the way the people do things. Why do this? Because God said so. And gradually, these kinds of bonds have withered away. And we are left kind of forced to face the fact that there's nothing there to first stop us from doing horrific things, and two, to give us a moral compass that is unquestionable, that is unquestioned. And at the end of the book, he makes a case for pragmatism. And he says, we have to agree on certain things because they allow us to live together. So it doesn't mean that whoever's in the majority can just crush the other side, or if you just win a majority, then you've won everything. It means that we have to find a way to live together without thinking, well, gee, the world would be a lot better if we could just delete these individuals. Like, that's not the good, if you have to think that, we're going the wrong direction here. Okay, we have to find some consensus in a pluralistic society that allows us, and it means that nobody necessarily gets everything that they want. All right, the abortion issue again, both sides are pretty unhappy with the result, and yet pragmatically it functions to a certain extent, and there's a lot of debate and so on that try to like push this forward. Right, this is all that I am arguing for.
Well, and here's the thing, like these objections about the tyranny of the majority, I think need to be taken up and examined. I do think there's a contradiction within just flat democratic principles, and we should think them through. But even if we don't believe that what's ultimately going to be the way that society works in a socialist sense, that is, even if we think socialism will transcend the concept of democracy, what we have to admit is that we are aiming at creating a world where everyone has the power to think for themselves, speak for themselves, and produce in a way that it serves them as well as the whole. And however that works out, whether it's through consensus or through some other mechanism, that should be something that we hold on to, because the aim is to emancipate individuals and the society as a whole. Can I quickly address something that came up earlier, a comment that I've just been itching to talk to here, speak to. Rumco, this is way back about the EU and the way the disinformation project in the EU is being run. And he says that, it's not true that every country will be having to follow those, the laws of the most extreme country. Each one has its own jurisdiction and will, the police will enforce the laws of that country and not of the EU as a whole. And that's true. However, when it comes to disinformation, one of the things that the EU stipulates is that they are not tasked with enforcing laws, but with controlling speech. So the speech that's being targeted is by and large defined as legally protected speech by the EU. So they're acting extra legally. They're illegally, I would say, often enough, depending on the country. But what I also think is true is that even in the United States, hate speech has been rolled in with the disinformation campaign, given that it isn't that the whole effort is breaking with the Constitution. the fact that hate speech is legally protected in the United States doesn't really have a bearing. But I also do think that they would look to, countries in the West with the most draconian speech laws to kind of set the standards for what constitutes the legally protected hate speech that they're nonetheless going to censor. That's just my understanding from
The
looking
thing
at
is, like, the EU doesn't have competence in certain areas, right? And the thing is that they know that, and they lament it. So what they will often do is they will have directives that are aimed to kind of nudge countries. So they tend to do things in underhanded ways. And then they will punish countries that don't follow these things. So this is happening now, obviously, with Hungary, where because they've taken these super extreme kind of responses to a lot of this stuff, they're now doing all sorts of things to kind of, essentially sanction them or to discipline them in certain ways. So, this is the thing, like, people are kind of obsessed with, like, well, unless there's like a formal thing, and in a lot of cases there is, but unless there's like a formal statement that says X, then it's not happening. No, these things happen in a lot of underhanded ways. So there's like, they'll use all sorts of things like rule of law, but it's also selective. So Macron will go on and on about the rule of law, but then when it suits him to raise the retirement age, he invokes certain articles so that he can get around precisely the rule of law. And it doesn't matter because he follows the line. He toes a certain line that the EU wants. And we have to understand too, like, a lot of people see the EU as like this bastion of rights. Like, again, because we have this idea that those in power, we just have to like speak to the manager and then they'll gift our rights to us. That's not how these things happen. We fought for a shorter working week, all of these sorts of things. So they see the EU as like, oh, this like protectorate, but they are the neoliberal institution par excellence. And a lot of what they do is dressed up in social justice language, but and I've talked about this before, but its purpose is ultimately economic. I mean, that's obviously its whole purpose since the beginning, is economic union. And they get involved in all this social stuff, even though they don't have competence there, and they get involved in all this stuff because at the end of the day, and they dress it up like, oh, it's about European values. We need to make sure that people hold European values. We need to do all these things. But like, they want dual earner households, for instance. They need to push people into precarious forms of work they otherwise would not want to take. And in particular, they need women to work. And that's their whole growth model. And so they dress it up in like gender equality and smashing gender norms. But their goal is to make it really fucking uncomfortable should you make the wrong choice that is to stay at home and take care of your children if you are a woman. Now, I'm not saying that that's a choice that you should make, but it's a choice that many women wish to make. And in particular, that many women wish to make in a cultural context that pisses on women if they fuck up, right? Like, so you're like, there's this this tension that Sharon Hayes talks about in The Cultural Contradictions of Motherhood, a very famous book from 1996, where she talks about how you have these in capitalist society, women have, or parents generally, especially now parents, have this dual poles. You're supposed to be 100% an intensive worker. That is, you should be completely and totally dedicated to your job. And to extend this, it's not something that she says, but I'm extending this. Like, the measure of feminism is how many female CEOs you have, that sort of thing. And on the other hand, you must also be an intensive mother. That the huge, like, family policy has generally collapsed with the overtake of neoliberalism and policy from the 1990s onward. Family policy has collapsed into parenting, parents, and child policy, where the family becomes the purpose of the family is to meet a number of key performance indicators, KPIs, right? So like, you are tasked with employability, like you have to create employable subjects that will have all of these skills. It's about skill building and so on. And so that becomes also your intensive responsibility, and any problems not any problems, but a huge range of problems in society get blamed on parents and the family. And so in that context, as a woman, you're like, well, I can't. And so women will opt for one side or the other. They will say, I'm not going to have children. I'm going to focus on my career 100%, or I'm going to focus on being a mother 100%. And the EU is trying to do all sorts of things to like force by diktat that you opt for both, that you have to do both. And if you don't do both, your life is going to be really hard and really uncomfortable for you.
Yeah. The underlying point that I was trying to raise with disinformation was that in this particular case, it is admitted that controlling disinformation online is not a matter of law, but is some sort of social regulation being spearheaded by the EU in Europe and by Department of Homeland Security in the United States, and actually probably by intelligence agencies in individual nations in Europe as well. But the key to it is that accidentally, if you read their documents, they do admit again and again that the effort to control and combat control information and combat disinformation is an attack on free speech. It has to be, and in the EU, it has to be for a number of reasons. One of which is exactly because each member nation has its own jurisdiction and ability to enforce law, separate from and instead of the EU. But the bureaucracies always sort of operate in these, less than transparent ways, and and part of the point of that is to keep the riffraff from having a say, keep making sure that only the clean and polite and educated rulers or leaders or elite will be involved in the most important decision making that goes on. It is a technocratic, you're quite right, it's like a neoliberal technocratic institution. The technocracy is in the United States as well, through these NGOs and within the bureaucracy of the state, including the intelligence agencies. And I think one of the biggest enemies of the socialist project is the technocracy, that given that it is the ruling class right now. The technocrats rule. They rule in service to capital, but they do rule. And our aim is to overturn capital, and that means overturning the power of the technocracy.
And of course, it's not like surprising that the EU is the institution that does this, because that was part of why these sorts of institutions at that level were set up, precisely to insulate policymakers from the hoi polloi. I've only seen this word written down. Now I've said it out loud. I'm a fucking idiot. I hope I said it correct.
You said it right.
I shouldn't have said anything. Anyway, to insulate people precisely from that again, I think one of the, I say this all the time, but I need to drive this home. Like, the saddest legacy of the Second World War was that Nazism was an overflow of democracy. And as I say, this is what the fascists said. That's what the fascists said, that democracy was an illusion, that the people were just being led by a demagogue, and they think that they're thinking clearly, but they're not. 1,000 empty heads imagine that they're thinking, blah, blah, blah. All right, that's what they thought. And this is the legacy. We basically said, yeah, the fascists were right. And so you need to insulate democracy from the masses. This is the irony, right? Like, for democracy to function, you just have to get rid of those pesky people. And so this is why these institutions, part of the reason these institutions were set up, to save themselves from the masses, so that this sort of thing wouldn't happen again. But of course, there were some segments of society that went along with fascism, but it wasn't. It wasn't a mass movement of the working class. And this is what people, particularly, I don't know why, but in American society, this is really hegemonic. That's what people think. And so anytime that you have any kind of working class uprising, it's like scary and unwashed and is going to lead to fascism, because that's the lesson that people took.
Someone asked in the chat, no, not that one, this one. So what about trans and LGBTQ people in China? Clearly a technocracy. Is China trying to genocide on them? And I'm not really wanting to address Chinese policy. I do think that China is far less open and more likely to prosecute or persecute people for their sexual orientation than the United States is. That's at least my impression. But the question of trans and LGBTQ rights, I feel as though it should be able to be swept up in a protection of universal rights. That ultimately, the rights of individuals to have their own private sexual lives and to determine their own mode of dress and their own expression should be universal. And it doesn't have to be in that when we think about the oppression of LGBTQ or trans people, we should think of that as the oppression of us, of the public in general, of everyday, of our own rights. These aren't separate from the rights of society as a whole or individuals. These are the rights that individuals should demand, and which is why it's not important to me whether or not a trans person is really a woman in some essential way, or is actually driven by certain sexual orientation to dress in a particular way, or it doesn't matter. The fact is that the individual has the right to wear a dress if they want to, or wear pants if they want to modify their body to the way that in the way that they'd like to rename themselves if they'd like, to wear their hair long or short, and any state that wants to intervene on that level and control how people conceive of themselves and operate in the world on that level is smashing the rights of everyone in the process. And that's how I think about it.
Yeah, but of course, there are some issues here that still need to be worked out, right? So this is the issue, that some groups feel that there are contradictions. And what's interesting is that this was a controversy within LGBTIQ, which is what the acronym that the EU uses, and is a simpler one to use as a shorthand. But there were some controversies all the way, going back to the 90s into the early 2000s, where it was just sort of an LG movement. Well, it was a gay rights movement, and then gay began to refer more to men. So then people started to use the word lesbian, and then you had bisexuals, and that was a little bit controversial within sort of the existing gay rights community, but that was worked out, and it became LGB. And then when the trans sort of issue started to, or at least activists started to move up the agenda, or that issue began to move up the agenda, at least within those movements in the 90s, there was some uncertainty, and into the early 2000s. So there was a piece of legislation in the United States, for instance, that would have been the first legislation to actively enshrine the rights of lesbian, gay, and bisexual people. And it was pretty strong likelihood that it would finally be passed after 30 years. And there was a bit that was but incorporated into the policy about gender. And this caused it to be stalled in the American courts. And there was controversy within the LGBTIQ community that said, well, look, this is something that people have been fighting for 30 years, and now it's effectively being vetoed. And there may be a contradiction here in that LGB is about sexuality and sexual orientation, but TIQ is about gender and sex. These are different things.
Okay, can you? I'm sorry, I'm going to be.
I'm saying that this was a controversy that was existing within these communities.
Yeah, I know, but I'm going to ask you a really
in the 2015,
question.
there were some trans groups that even wanted
trans,
to separate.
T is trans, right? I is intersex. Yeah.
Oh yes, sorry, intersex and queer.
And then, what is queer pointing to that T and I doesn't point to, and why is there a need for I as well as T? I guess intersex are people who are born with their sexual, they may have like hermaphrodites. Basically, is that intersex? Is that what we're talking about?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry, I'm such a boomer here with this. So that's I. And then what is Q pointing to? I don't understand why there's an.
So queer is like, and again, there's some controversy about this because there are some people in the gay community who, and it's mainly like LGB Alliance, I think, that has raised an issue with this, that queer has come to become a stand-in for lesbian, gay, and bisexual. But it's a much more expanded kind of concept. And I want to make it clear. I'm just like sort of setting out what the debate has been
it's
the last like 30, 40 years.
LBG, I don't remember now even the order of this, but the lesbian, gay, and bisexuals are the beginning of this. Then there's the transsexual or transgender, and then the intersex. And then there's lesbian, gays, and bisexuals again in queer at the end. Is that right?
Yeah, but it's more, it can also include people who are, for all intents and purposes, heterosexual.
Right.
So I think
I remember I'm one of
yes.
those. I'm a sapiosexual, and that makes me Q. That so yeah, okay, now I get it. Okay, let's move on. So,
yeah. Anyways, so there in even as late as 2015, there were trans groups, or maybe some individuals even, who argued that they wanted to sort of separate from LGB because their concerns were different. And so there's sort of controversy even within these groups about there being potentially different sort of things going on. So when it comes to rights and like universal rights, there are different things that we kind of need to work out because there are existing kinds of tensions. And you might say, well, it's not that big of a deal. So one is about sexuality and one is about gender, until you kind of go and try to live in the world. And then you come up with some potential issues. And this is what some lesbian, gay, and bisexual people have started arguing. And now, of course, we're in this situation where there can be no controversy and there's the complete denial that there is any controversy and these people are just assholes. Then there's, you can't really have any debate around that. But there are certainly some groups in society who feel as though there are, and of course, the elephant in the room is the women's groups who feel that there's a tension between sex and gender. So this is like ratcheting up, right? Like it just gets ratcheted up. And people become more and more and more and more extreme. And I think that there probably is a sane middle ground that we could find. And someone said, like in the comments, they gave an example of a policy and they said, well, that was undemocratic and historical policy that just was an example of naked power and that it was effective. And I agree. There are some cases in which naked power is exercised, and we kind of agree that's a good thing. As a society, we've kind of said, yeah, it's good that we went through that. But I think in this situation, the point that I'm trying to make is that it's not working and it's leading to really bad outcomes. It's leading to people becoming more and more extreme and entrenched. And it's becoming clear that things might erupt in violence. And that, again, that's one way of resolving a difficulty. Like naked power can erupt in violence. It can be, it can be literally crushing the other side. But if we would like to avoid that, I think that we could probably try to find some bargaining, like we could bargain, not everybody's going to get exactly what they want, but we will be able to live together more effectively, I think, than we are now, where everybody's lost their mind.
Yeah, I agree with you that we should be able to try to come to a consensus. We should make allowances for the middle-aged. I really hope that you guys will make allowances for middle-aged cisgendered white guys like me when I ask questions like, why is the Q on there again? And I know how that reads, but nonetheless, I do think that we need to be able to try to come to a consensus about this without trying to crush the other side all the time, especially given that I think that overall most let's just say gay activists, lesbian activists say, do not want to create a society of strict gender roles or that's going to be oppressive to people who express their sexuality or gender conception differently. I don't think there's anything intrinsic to the movement for lesbian rights that means that they have to smash the expression of other orientations, and that it seems like I'm the contradiction. I mean, I guess the contradiction comes up where some trans women will define themselves as lesbian, as an example, and cisgendered lesbians don't like that. But really, how big of a problem is it to tell someone who's a trans woman you're not that kind of lesbian? That you're more, like how much more difficult is it than telling a straight guy that you're not into him? I don't think it. I don't know. I just seems like that's the kind of thing that people will just have to cope with in life. And so anyway, that's where I'll leave that.
Yeah, I mean, there's part of it is this railing against any kind of discrimination, and what is more discriminatory than sex, right? Like you discriminate when you choose a sexual partner, and I understand people who feel like really hurt by that. Absolutely, like to live out your life as a woman and then be rejected for something that you can do nothing about. I understand that is really painful. But like relationships are painful and messy in exactly that way. And part of growing up is accepting that, I think, even though I have an enormous amount of compassion for that situation, in the same way that I have enormous amounts of compassion for people who are unable to find partners just generally for all sorts of reasons. But there was someone mentioned in the comments, I've lost it now, but if gender, or what was it, if sex is a social construct, then nobody's cisgendered or something like that. And this was actually something that came up in the second half of the conversation that I had with James Lindsay, where he started to sort of rail against social constructionism. And I'm someone who uses social constructionism in my own work. And the point that I made there was that even if everything is a social construct, or like at least in the realm of language, right? Obviously, we have to, just by virtue of like being sounds with reference, like they are constructed in a product of consensus. But even if you want to like point to something firm, like I get that, right? Like everything seems up in the air. All that is solid melts into air. We search for something firm. And so people will search for biology. People do this all the time across the political spectrum. It's a caricature to say that leftists are like social constructionists. In fact, I find this really funny because leftists get accused all the time of saying truth and knowledge are socially constructed. But those people that were attacking me were calling me a stupid liar. And I was like, on what basis? On what basis can I be a stupid liar? If they live in a world where everything is socially constructed and I live in a world where everything is real, put me in it. Anyways, but even if it were the case that everything is socially constructed, like, so what? Like, we have to, even our biology. In fact, part of the reason why we're having this debate is biology exerts far less of a deterministic influence on our lives than it has in the past, or than it at least appeared to in the past. And so even if something is like biology, that still doesn't tell us how we're going to live. We still have to decide as a society which constructs we're going to live with, you know, how we're going to organize our society, what constructs allow us to live together in a way that more or less kind of works. And of course, you know, us being conflict theorists, we will say there's always going to be a certain amount of conflict, and the big one being class conflict. But I think generally when we live in these kinds of pluralistic societies, we can come to some consent. We do all the time come to a consensus that allows us to live together better. And one of the things that at least like have a sort of like a tenuous kind of situation we can carry on without erupting in violence constantly. And John Bunch said, "Oh, this is just the cycle of a moral panic." I think there's some truth to that. That everybody's panicking across the political spectrum. There's bigging up the threat. Right, the right is just bigging up the threat. They want to trans your kids, and then you know, and the left is also bigging up the threat. Like there's going to be a genocide, and the right is saying there's going to be a white genocide, and everybody's just fucking crazy. And I think, yeah, this is, and I've seen this because obviously this is what I study, moral panics and so on. I've been teaching about it for years, and you can see when things kind of calm down a bit, it's like we wake up from a nightmare, and we're kind of able to see a little bit more clearly. And I've been kind of waiting for that moment when we can speak clearly about things without trying to make each other disappear in some way or make each other's lives as fucking impossible as possible. And this, it's interesting because I always say it takes about 10 years for a moral panic to run its course. Really, if you think about the Satanic Panic, that took about a decade to kind of really run its course where people could speak a bit more clearly, because it was for a little while a bit, yeah, there was a lot of opposition. There was always opposition the whole way through. And most people were not convinced that there were like literally satanic people sacrificing babies, but it was able to make a huge amount of headway because like in polite society and in areas where people actually had control over policy, you had to believe the children, right? Are you saying that children are liars? This came from the mouths of babes, you know, it's like this kind of thing. And it became kind of personally risky. And then over time, you know, it became clearer and clearer that like we had to have some sane pathway through this, because clearly there's no Satanist. And maybe that's a bad example. I mean, there are Satanists, but I mean, there's clearly no satanic cult running the government, for instance.
Right. No, and they're not. And those Satanists that I've heard about, I've never met a Satanist really, but that I've heard about are fairly ineffectual and mostly law abiding, I think. Listen, we're at an hour and 7 minutes, and we should
Whoa, that
go
flew
off.
by. Jesus.
Yeah. So we should go to the can't speak. We should go to the Patreon, to the Parrot Room in the Patreon for the second half. I will create a link to it and put it into the description of this video and in the comments. You'll be able to see the live stream on Patreon. And then I'm linking the audio versions in the descriptions of the video streams. I know that's not the best for some of the patrons because it doesn't show up in the RSS feed, but it is a compromise between those who don't want to get 4 emails a day and those who want to be able to hear it on audio. I will think about how to do this going forward, but that's what it will be for today. Thank you all for watching the first free half, and we'll see you over on Patreon in about 15 minutes. We'll start at 10:30. So I'm going to hit the button wherever it is. Here it is, and see you on the other side.
In the case of nuclear